as I have been. The sessions yesterday were great. Excellent talk this morning as well. So lots of good ideas floating around here. This session is on urban adaptation and climate resilient cities. We've got 2 projects that were selected for this category. We also have a number of panelists. I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. First, on the far left of me, we have Christina Becker-Burke. She leads Meister Consultants Group's climate adaptation practice, and she focuses on finding ways to reduce barriers to private sector investment, particularly in developing countries. Christina, do you want to say a little more about yourself?
Sure. That summarizes it pretty well. We've also been doing a lot of work in the U.S. on climate resilience planning, working with Denver, Boston, higher ed institutions actually, such as MIT, and also dabbling a little bit with New York.
Great. Next to her is Bina Venkataraman. Works for the Obama administration, helping to implement the President's Climate Action Plan, which includes a pillar on resilience and adaptation. You want to talk a little more?
Just that I'm very happy to be here, and thanks to everyone for all that you're doing and all your interest in this important issue.
And finally, we have Julia Nissl. She leads development and implementation of policies and strategies to promote sound adaptation measures and reduce vulnerability along the coast. She works for the Massachusetts, I'm forgetting the Office of Coastal Zone Management. That's right. So, thanks, Julia.
So my program addresses erosion, flooding, and sea level rise primarily, and we work with local planners, conservation agents, and other local officials primarily in addressing those issues.
Great. So we've got a range of perspectives here from the federal level, much more on the local level, and then also in the international development arena. So a lot of good perspectives, and good to see folks at those different levels all sort of working on the same problems. So, so we've got two proposals. What I'd like to do is we'll start off going over each one, the video from each one. We'll give each one of the proposal developers a chance to introduce themselves and talk further about their proposal. Then we'll sort of turn it over to the panel to get some initial impressions on how they perceive the proposals working from their own experience. And from there we can open it up to questions from you in the audience, and just sort of keep the dialogue going. So I guess to start, we'll begin with Michael, who has a proposal on seasonal migration routes in Vietnam. So let's go ahead and see the video.
Can you see?
Other one.
Lock you up.
Wrong one.
I am a master's student at the university. Hi everyone, my name is Nguyen. I am a master's student at the University of Montreal Institute of Urban Planning. This project proposal is born from reflections that came along the way while writing my master's thesis. Emerging empirical research indicates that climate change currently plays a role in migration patterns, but none of these researches suggest solutions to sustainably deal with this increasingly observed phenomenon. The main objective of this project proposal is to prepare Vietnamese cities' housing infrastructures for potential seasonal migrants influx from southern coastal provinces. The first step in achieving this goal will be the creation of the Seasonal Migration Routes Identification System, also known as the SMRIS, which will predict the evolution of seasonal migratory routes in function of increasing vulnerability to flood faced by the urban or rural population in the Mekong Delta. The resulting information will be used to identify the potential number of environmental seasonal migrants and ensure that host cities and villages are being prepared to absorb this drastic temporary demographic change. In other words, the SMRs will serve city government and urban planners by providing them the necessary information to predict the city's influx or outflow of seasonal migrants and take the necessary action to ensure temporary housing availability and also, and most importantly, physical and financial accessibility. Current and future cities of Vietnam facing seasonal population growth will be invited to participate in an inter-municipal participatory workshop where structural and functional vulnerability of their housing infrastructures and solutions to increase their absorption capacity will be identified. Subsequently, concrete program and construction projects will be developed and implemented in different strategic areas. This project offers the possibility of addressing sea level rise and flood issues in a long-term development perspective. Environmentally motivated migrants will likely need support for integration, for establishing livelihoods in new areas, and accessing urban services to be protected from any discriminatory practices or policies. It is time to erase the borders between what are too often conceived as closed communities of settled citizens and support a more flexible and integrated migratory lifestyle. I am glad to be attending the Crowds and Climate Conference. Thanks to the MIT Climate Collab for offering us a platform where innovative strategies such as this one can be heard of and be collectively improved.
Great. Michael, do you want to say a few words to expand on the topic a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I want to first mention the irony of presenting a video with such poor technological skill at the MIT, but that was the best. So judge a project on its content, please. So thanks for all the panelists to be here, for commenting on the project and the public too. Well, basically, it's a new and first at the same time seasonal internal environmental migration management strategy. The project will have a discussion on aim at softening the migration experience of households, and also aimed at providing the city planners and authorities a new adaptation strategy. Migration has long been seen as a failure, and be it in the academic area, for government, or also in local population, and I think so worldwide. But if there's one thing you need to remember when you will be leaving this room, is that it's not a failure, and there's a lot of coastal zone in Vietnam, in the Mekong more particularly, that water is taking back the land, and people only have one choice, and at the moment is to move, or to move on a seasonal basis. I think what is missing in this video is how this project is, well, it's made for the people, but how it's made by the people too. And the idea came from observation and literature review on current governmental project, which is permanent relocation. And well, it's been observed that people doesn't really participate in the process of relocation, and there's a lot of social tension there, because how it works, they look at the commune level. It's a territory and an administrative region, and they take the people that are more at risk, and they make a relocation settlement. But the thing is, commune is not the same as community, so you get a mix of members of different community, which is not always in good relation, and they're en route from their land, so from their culture. And anyway, there's other kind of infrastructure deficiencies there. So the idea is to integrate a new approach and a participatory approach in all the steps of the project. And before we move to the discussion, I just want to thank my research institute, which is a Vulnerability, Resilience, and Sustainable Reconstruction Research Alliance, which is a partnership between Université de Montréal, McGill University, and Concordia, who made it possible for me to be here to present this project. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Michael. So now I'd like to turn it over to the panel and just get some initial impressions. How what do you think of the project? Ideas to expand on it, or?
Sure, I'm happy to begin. So congratulations on being a winner. You've put together certainly a very interesting concept that seeks to address a real need. And it's really challenging to predict what the impacts of climate change are going to be, because you don't know when a disaster is going to strike, and you don't know what the severity is going to be. But your tool seeks to at least estimate what the potential routes could be based upon a couple of different scenarios, so making planning a little bit easier, and certainly supporting a conversation about seasonal migration and how to best manage it. So I think you're on to addressing a real need that exists. My suggestions for you as you seek to refine your concept is really that your scope is incredibly wide. You have many different steps and several different potential funders who could fund different types of the steps. Try to think through, I would suggest sort of mapping out the process also in like really visual steps, as well as also evaluating who your key target audiences are in terms of your funder, your data source for collection, your sources for data collection, your workshop participants, who the seasonal migrants themselves, what is it that their needs are, and how is it that this can address their needs, and how is it that you're going to leverage the resources they're able to provide. And then I would tailor your pitch accordingly. I think your workshops and the dialogues, who's a potential funder for that? Is it Asian Development Bank? Is it going to be the local government? Similarly, data collection, is it a volunteer network? That's going to be a different pitch than if you're trying to work with the local universities to collect some of the data that you need. Sort of your business plan also isn't really clear, so somehow you would want to recover your costs, and figuring out how you're going to recover your costs would also factor into that conversation. And then my additional suggestion for you is think about ways in which this could directly help the seasonal migrants. The way currently it seems to be tailored towards a tool for government planners, those providing technical assistance, but what about the seasonal migrants themselves? Could this be a tool that shows, oh, there are 5 main routes to get here. This route is really busy right now, or this route has a blockage because the flood crept up quicker than expected. Could it be a tool to help them with their migration? Could it be a tool that provides sort of an Airbnb services for those looking for housing along the way, or those who are needing to generate a little bit of funding along the way and needs to do, like, we're familiar with TaskRabbit, small little tasks along the way. Sort of thinking through some of the different ways in which, that's expanding your scope again, but thinking through the ways in which you could also potentially help and support the seasonal migrants in it. So potentially you break this concept into a couple of different concepts within an umbrella, so those are some of my initial thoughts for you.
Great, thanks.
I don't know if you wanted to engage on those or not, but I can jump in here. I think those were a great set of suggestions. I think this project is critically important. I think that the problem you're trying to address just underscores how much the climate change is a humanitarian problem, it's a security problem, it's an economic problem, it's a problem about people. It's not just a problem about the environment, and I just applaud you for you're thinking about this and your framing of this project at the intersection of those very important human problems and sort of the change that we're undergoing. So I think that it's really great, and I think that the knowledge that you extract from this process can be broadly helpful, if framed right, can be broadly helpful for potentially other areas that are thinking about similar displacement patterns, similar migrant populations. So I guess one area where it feels like you have a sort of critical deliverable that you want to make is around the sort of data and information piece, and Christina touched on this as well. And so I think that that's something that's becoming a very shared, common understanding of being a critical component of resilience and adaptation strategies, is to have data-driven knowledge about kind of what the scope of the problem is, where the vulnerabilities are. And so I would also encourage you to think strongly about the partners you need for data, and how those partners can both help you with the understanding collection of those data in a sensitive context that both involves displaced people, the cultural context, the political context of Vietnam, which I'm sure you've been familiarizing yourself with, and also those who can help you with the sort of data delivery part. And again, I think Christina had some interesting examples of how the data delivery could be deployed both for government audiences, city planner audiences, civil society, but also for migrants themselves. And I think with the spread of mobile technology throughout Asia, that there might be a unique opportunity there to sort of partner with potential data delivery entities that could help you. So those are, I guess, around the data, I would say, potential ways to sort of help your project go forward. I think the other component of this is just, for me, I worked a year in Vietnam with migratory populations, which we talked about last night, but do not profess to be an expert at all on them, and they were very different migrants. But I think it might be useful for others in the room to hear a little bit of how you talked to me about this sort of tension. I explained my sort of struggle of trying to work with the intermediaries, and how you think about getting your audience of government folks to listen, but also work and serve the populations that you're trying to serve, and sort of who the partners are from civil society and otherwise that you're thinking about engaging to help you with that process and to help you reach your audience. So it might be worth just hearing from you a little bit more on that, I think.
Yeah, okay.
We can take that now, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so I'll start with the question raised by Christina. In reality, the scope of the project, the funders, and the potential implementers are kind of all related to one another, and that's why there's not so much detail about the budget, because depending on the potential implementer, it will dictate the scale of the project. So the scale of the data that we can collect, and if it's a region-wide data collection, or if it's only the two southern provinces that I put in this project to try to scale down a little bit the scope of the project. And it will also dictate the number of cities that will be that will see construction project be implemented in there. And so yeah, and I need to see if there's any financial capacity of the household to pay a certain monthly rent while they're there, if it's possible or not, depending on their economic revenues. That will play to it on the budget. And the thing is, with the potential implementers and funders, is in Vietnam there's two ways of implementing that kind of project. One is from a foreigner perspective. You can be associated with one ministry and be an ad hoc institution there, which is not the ideal, because you're under one particular ministry, and in the case of a construction project, housing infrastructures, you need to be in coordination with the construction ministry, social affairs ministry, the environmental ministry, and police officers. So you get this kind of collaboration issue. Or the other way is to directly be integrated into the political structures, and that will eventually affect who's funding or not the project, and where the money comes from. Is it from the government, or is it from a big non-profits organization? And there's also the fact that funders, we will have to see who's getting involved, because I think it's a multi-actor project. So, for example, and it raised another question that another issue that you raised about the project is other non-profit organization will have to be involved to provide, for example, the healthcare services and social assistance to the migrants there. So depending of who we get into the project, it will affect. Yeah, I lost track. Sorry, and that's pretty much it.
So can I just jump in there and say,
yeah.
I mean, maybe we just can have a conversation here a little bit, if you don't mind. But so you mentioned this, so there's a role there. For example, you gave this example of the healthcare providers that you would want to be able to figure out how your recommendations that emerge from this study and this work could be supported by those who could provide health services to the migrants. So I guess you could almost see mapping out those kinds of outcomes. So what are the long-range goals that you want from this? It's you know, more something that approaches community, goes from the spectrum, along the spectrum from commune to community for the migrants. It's health services during periods of displacement. It's a flexible, you know, a flexible structure and process that allows for an alternative to permanent relocation. So you could see mapping out all of those things and then figuring out who are the key players in that region who are capable of providing those things ultimately if your recommendations, in an ideal scenario, if your recommendations were all received, which is, I think, what, if I were you, I would be trying to aim for that reality. And then figuring out who the audiences are that you need to be in the room to present that to. Maybe it's multiple rooms that you're presenting it in, so that you can get those different outcomes into place, and so mapping those audiences and partners to those outcomes.
Thanks.
Great. Julia, do you want to add on to anything?
I guess I just want to reinforce a lot of things that Christina and Bina said, you know, as far as kind of your foundational data, but also thinking towards your end product and how that might transfer to other cultures, other countries, and, you know, making sure that there's some really good lessons learned there for transferability.
I think similar. I think the opposite side of that coin is, and this may be part of the study you've already done, and would also be interesting to hear from you on this. But are there models from other countries where a more flexible system of resettlement and migration occurs? And are there any models that, even if they're very context and culturally specific, that you think are working, where you think attributes can be imported? And if so, it would be fun, I think, for all of us to hear about them, and maybe there's people in the room who actually know of such examples that could be potential, if not perfect models for you, sources of research.
Maybe we can open the discussion. I honestly don't have any example of this kind of project somewhere else. So, but maybe after I can come back on the data. Just, does anyone know any example of?
Open it up to the crowd here.
I would have to look for that. That's a really interesting point.
Actually, a relevant example is where this kind of migrants Oh. So one of the examples that you could look at is in Bangladesh, where the same kind of seasonal migration is happening in the Indo-Gangetic plain. And if I understand your question or sort of your premise correctly, what you're trying to do is find data for planners to be able to accommodate this kind of seasonal migration, right? There's a couple of things I think you need to understand about that adaptation is a moving target. And there's many people who are going to migrate but not go back because there's not enough arable land left anymore. So it needs to be a longitudinal study, and the data needs to be refreshed again and again. So that's one point that you need to remember. And the other thing is that I think in Chittagong and Dhaka, planners are already working towards sort of having this migratory population being assimilated in the city. And every year it's different, the nature is different. It also depends on the economic opportunities of where they land versus how they want to go back. So those are all things that you need to look at to make this viable, really. So.
Thank you. Also, it opens up for data collection. There was what I was thinking of is a tool that could map at the same time the environmental risk and the migration patterns, so that we can have a model that shows up in a long time scale. How it has to be long, because not only because things are changing, but also because to make this kind of construction project in a long-term development perspective, if we see that a lot of migrations are going somewhere in the city, in one of the cities right now, and the needs are there, but in 5 or 6 years, this city is going to be highly at risk of flood. It has to be considered where we build the project, so it can be sustainable. And
do that so that some of the migration does not happen because once the people are displaced, then it's very, very hard to sort of give them the kind of community and lifestyle that I can provide them. So it works both ways.
Yeah, there's a lot of adaptation strategy right now, but the biggest issue is the saline water intrusion for the agricultural land. So a lot of people I shouldn't say a lot of people, I don't have numbers exactly, but yeah, so some of them will move on a seasonal basis, and few of them won't come back because their land is they cannot exploit the resources, so they will stay. Well, the project aim at integrating these people into the housing infrastructure there and provide them with educational training for developing their professional skills, and also other tools to really integrate the urban system where in the host city, because they won't be able to go back. So there could be some kind of a program of transition where they can really establish well their life there, instead of going into the periphery and building some kind of shelters that is not really viable, and often they go on the periphery, which is an area at risk of floods. So yeah, there's this this part, you're right, from the migrants that won't come back. But for coming back to the scenarios, I think there's really one interesting research that came out in 2012 made by UNESCO and researchers from Netherlands, and they made up scenarios based on the possible changes of hydrological conditions, including spatial and temporal distribution of flood, modification of wet and dry season precipitation, and alteration of climate change. alteration of salinity intrusion patterns. So there's this idea of integrating this uncertainty at the level of the environment, but also I would like to integrate maybe or develop the tool so that it can integrate new data on, for example, the industrial development in the Mekong Delta. So maybe it's still an attractive place to go instead of going a little bit northern to Ho Chi Minh Ville City, or yeah, they're raising economic revenues that will dictate a little bit if they need this kind of institution or not. So. Yeah.
There's many things that are happening.
Yeah, and so yeah, in the once they are in the institution and in the city, it's the occasion to train them to diversify their economic activity. The goal is to provide them the necessary to go back and reconstruct or diversify their revenues, not to make them dependent of this this kind of yeah.
Great. Well, I hate to cut the discussion, but I think it would be good if we move to the other project, just to give her a chance to speak, and then we can kind of wrap up and maybe talk about the two together. Lynn is hopefully still with us, waiting patiently virtually. There she is. Let's start with the video, and then we can come back to Lynn and let her expand on it a little bit, and yeah, we'll take it from there.
Hello, my name is Lynn Rosentrader, and I'm a PhD candidate in computer geography at the University of Oslo. Adaptation to climate change takes place in response to observed or expected changes in the frequency and intensity of extreme events through actions that reduce vulnerability to climate risks. This proposal uses familiar techniques for assessing vulnerability to climate change and integrates them with the knowledge and experience of populations at risk. The approach is designed to mitigate communication barriers that can limit adaptation decision-making. Assessing vulnerability requires the integration of data produced at different scales. So many planners use geographic information systems to ground their analyses in spatially nuanced evaluations of risk. Methods for mapping vulnerability are dominated by indicator-based approaches that serve policymakers' needs for simple, generalized, and actionable information. Integral GIS is a mixed methods approach to vulnerability mapping that focuses on the perceptions and values of local actors in adaptation processes. Objective data characterize the exposure and adaptive capacity to climate change. Locate vulnerable areas and populations through traditional mapping exercises. However, qualitative methods are better at revealing the multidimensional nature of vulnerability, and subjective data, collected through participatory engagements with stakeholders, provide valuable insights into the determinants of vulnerability, and more importantly, the people, places, and institutions that foster resilience. My research focuses on the practice of formulating adaptation plans, and Integral GIS was developed for addressing the vulnerability of elderly populations in Norway, but it can be applied to any adaptation situation where there are diverse stakeholders and conflicting interests. With support from the Climate Collab community, I will investigate the risk of sea level rise to demonstrate how Integral GIS provides a platform for navigating the political and emotional terrain of people facing inevitable change and loss. I look forward to your feedback and for discussions on best practices for planning climate resilient cities. Thank you.
Great. Welcome, Lynn. Good evening, probably, where you're at in Norway. yeah, please expand upon the video and the project.
Great. Thank you very much. And I would especially like to thank the conference organizers for facilitating all this amazing technology that's made it possible for me to participate from Norway. I participated yesterday in the plenary sessions and another breakout session, and everything went so smoothly. So this is sort of mind-boggling that this works so well. I think just to add a little context about my proposal, which is really derived from my dissertation research, and I've been focusing on really looking and studying how we adapt to climate change. And in particular, what we found in our research group is that especially the process of adaptation planning is a very social process. And so to really deconstruct that and understand how to actually make that better and how it can then be transferable to a number of different contexts. So my starting point, of course, is looking at spatial planning in particular, treating adaptation as a problem of spatial planning, and really building on the strengths that spatial planning has, which include, for example, the ability to act on and coordinate matters of collective concern for the public good, a way of thinking and acting across various spatial, temporal, and governance scales, while also understanding and acting on local circumstances and peculiarities. And then finally, this ability to really think about the future and to coordinate activities of a range of actors to achieve long-term benefits. One of the most important tools, or a very valuable tool within spatial planning, of course, is geographic information systems. So I've really looked at that tool in particular as a way, as a repository of spatial knowledge sets. And so fundamentally, this combination of using mixed methods approaches, combining very traditional mapping exercises with what we know about the involvement of stakeholders and working with stakeholders, I came to this process that I've been calling integral GIS, which is a facilitated multi-stakeholder engagement for creating knowledge that serves the collective good of protecting the health and well-being of communities. It was developed with a case study in mind looking at vulnerability of elderly populations in Norway. And at that point, what we were really investigating was how do we build an adaptation plan that really crosses the jurisdictional lines of all of the different departments and agencies within a municipality that have interactions and deal with the elderly. But I think and what I'm proposing here in this plan is to actually design a pilot study that works very specifically with communities at direct risk, because I think it's possible to use integral GIS to really create a frame of reference within which participants, particularly participants with conflicting interests, can share and integrate their information, compare perspectives, and really use spatial information as a platform for negotiating shared understandings. And the case I think that is most relevant would, of course, be a situation of sea level rise, where you've got communities and particular property owners who have very, very emotional connections to where they're living and how they're potentially impacted. At the same time, you've got a lot of regulation and land use that wants to control and protect the well-being of those places. So I think those areas create an interesting tension point that I believe integral GIS can help mitigate and come to a common understanding. So I think, I think I'll leave it there as far as an introduction and a context, and I look forward just to hearing the feedback from the panel.
Great, thank you, Lynn. Panel, let's start on this end, and we'll go, Julia, in the other direction.
Lynn, thank you for putting this together. I completely agree with you on the kind of foundational piece that it's really politics and emotions that take over when we start to feel the pressures of climate impacts. And I think it's fantastic that you're bringing that element into the standard scientific and planning approach, because we could have the best policies, plans, and adaptation strategies that have regulatory ramifications in place, but when it comes down to it, if we don't have the residents involved in the process and on board with kind of the long-term direction, we're going to really lose ground. And the only advice, I guess, for this project is that you want to think about how people's perceptions of impacts change over time, and try and standardize that as much as you can, I guess.
Lynn, this is Bina. I'm not sure if you can see us or if you just hear us, but this is a really, I think, has fantastic promise. And though you're over there in Norway, I have to tell you that this really aligns with what the U.S. president is trying to do in terms of stimulating innovation around data, in order for that data to become actionable information for communities and citizens as they're preparing for climate change, as they're thinking about how to make their communities more resilient. And so it's sort of the very thing that we're trying to encourage through the President's Climate Data Initiative and related efforts that are really about how do communities generate their own knowledge, and how does that knowledge pair with data about climate change impacts, such as the sea level rise scenarios that you're playing out, in order to create better knowledge, but also the ability to plan. And I guess just the question I would ask for clarification, it sounds like the way that you're going about this, from the way you talked about sort of the conversation about the future and how the future plays out for a community, is to actually play out scenarios and have those scenarios be potentially visualized through your tool geospatially, and to have people be able to react to those scenarios. And I think there are some interesting examples of that that may be worth consulting from work that has happened after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and an interesting center in Phoenix called the Decision Center for a Desert City. And these are a couple of just some examples of efforts that I know that are happening to help communities collaboratively with data innovators and climate scientists to understand the scenarios, as well as city planners and others who are kind of guides of the community, to envision different scenarios and envision different decisions they could make as communities and how those scenarios will play out. And it sort of sounds like that's what you're driving towards with the sort of initial step of how do we actually map the community knowledge onto the sort of scientific knowledge. So it's great, and I actually shouldn't make such a distinction, because I think a lot of what you're doing here is actually empowering community scientists or citizen scientists, as the sort of the trend is called.
I don't know if you want to respond first, or if you'd like to hear my feedback.
Lynn, go ahead if you've got a response.
Okay, I'll go ahead and start with those first two comments. Thank you very much. It's actually the experience of participating in the Climate CoLab has been really inspirational and motivational for me as I sort of in this final stage of my dissertation. So it's great to get such positive feedback and encouragement. I wanted to say, I think maybe that one of the strengths of this project is really not so much that it's about looking at scenarios and seeing how scenarios play out, but it also ends up becoming a two-way street, where instead of just the one-way process of providing residents and community members with information of what the future might look like, it really is designed to really embrace the agency of residents and local actors to actually provide feedback of what is their personal resilience. How do they actually respond in certain cases? And of course we know that by studying other types of disasters, and in particular heat waves, that that outcomes are not uniform even within disadvantaged communities. And so planners have a lot to learn from vulnerable people themselves about the kinds of resilience that they have and embrace, and then how that they can then carry that forward into long-term programs. So really, as much as it is about mapping vulnerabilities and exploring scenarios, it is this integral GIS really provides this platform for this co-generation of new knowledge where there's actually learning happening on both sides of the problem. So.
Great. Christina?
So, Lynn, likewise, I'd echo thoughts of Bina and Julia that this is a very interesting concept. I'm particularly excited by it because of it's highly replicable. It's relevant to communities all around the world. It could be focused on a really small scale, but also on a bigger scale. And it can be tailored to a range of different contexts and also to different types of vulnerabilities and risks. I mean, it could be tailored beyond sort of adaptation planning, but generally for any type of planning. So I think that is what's very interesting on the concept. I think what it does is it raises the question of what is the best role for the public to play in adaptation planning. And you know, there are a range of different types of roles they can play, but this framework could run the risk of catering to certain interest groups or rather than key vulnerabilities. And you know, from my experience so far, we've found that participatory processes are oftentimes particularly helpful in visioning and the setting of priorities. So if your mapping highlights what some of the key vulnerabilities are, you know, those can be the key vulnerabilities, but as a community and for planners who are trying to figure out what to prioritize given their limited budgets, engaging through a tool such as this about sort of helping set or at least getting the public's insight on what they view as the key vulnerabilities that should be prioritized so that a response and mitigation strategies and activities can be designed and implemented accordingly, I think is particularly helpful. So perhaps this tool also works in two steps. First, for sort of prioritizing the vulnerabilities and then having a conversation about once some of the key activities have been decided, how those could be implemented and some of the different viewpoints. It does beg the question of who's the decision maker here. Is this a tool that is used only by sort of the municipal government and they have the ownership of it and they ultimately will decide based upon the inputs that they receive, or is it meant to be more of a dialogue conversation tool? You know, sort of its role, it could be different depending on the scenario, but it's something that you know, has different implications, and government doesn't always want to have participation depending on where it is. You know, they're interested in it to the extent that it helps them get their work done. But if their job is going to be playing referee the entire time and they're not going to be able to get their work done, well then they're going to want to, there's going to need to be some very clear value added of how it's going to help the government be more effective and be more productive. And again, that's going to be implemented on a case-by-case example, but that's sort of, that business case is something that you could build into your concept to strengthen it a little bit more and to really excite sort of governments and planners to want to participate in this. Again, I'm guessing they would pay for this tool. You know, similar question that I had for Mikhail is sort of, you know, what's going to be your revenue stream and how are you going to cover your costs for this? But those are sort of my main points and thoughts so far.
Lynn, any response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I have quite a number, and I'll start with the last comment first and sort of work my way up. So I've been working with municipalities to actually find what's happening within local governments, and one of the advantages of focusing specifically on local government is that so many local governments today do actually already make use of geographic information, already have a spatial infrastructure in place to help them with decision making. So there's not a lot of budgetary issues because spatial planning and GIS is already a part of their daily work. What is necessary, of course, is this outside facilitation to make things happen, because as much as anything else, this process is really about consensus building and using the tool, using that visual information that's derived from the spatial knowledge to really come to some mutual understanding of what the problem is and what potential solutions could work. I wanted to say, though, in terms of, because my research has actually focused in particular on cities in a European city, although this does have wide application to North America. I think what we've seen lately in the geospatial realm of the world is this widespread explosion of the geo-web, where so much is now being geolocated, so much information and maps and spatial information is really becoming a part of our daily lives in ways that we have never experienced before. I know a lot of the participatory information that I've actually drawn from originated from public participation GIS, which has its origins in natural resource management in developing countries. And I think it's really just a small step before we can actually see that a planning tool like this can really make the leap from a local government context into a community-based organization, or really a crowdsourced context that we can actually interact with through different devices that can read and collect and make use of geolocated information. So I'm glad that you saw the relevance of or the applicability of this to really global contexts, because I too believe that it does have a lot of potential there, even though my research has actually focused on what's happening in local governments.
Fantastic. Since I have a microphone, I'm going to ask a question too. The focus on GIS, which I think is a amazing way to communicate certain things, climate risk, and giving people something that's somewhat tangible, a way to sort of understand it. Is there limitations you find in the types of climate risk that this method is really effective for, and are there ways that you can take the sort of overall process of integrating more of the social sciences into looking at other kinds of impacts, and how does that play out?
It's a good question, and of course, those of us who work with geographic information systems are really well aware that that the distribution of the technology and access to the technology is not even, and so that's a really big concern, particularly when one of the objectives of a project like this is really about community empowerment and trying to actually get more people involved. And so I try to be a little circumspect when I say that, you know, city governments have access to this kind of technology. Most do, but not all. And there is a really large barrier when it comes to being able to use technologies like this. At the same time, I think if I were to kind of evaluate kind of the different range of climate risks and what tends to be most appropriate for geographic information systems like or spatial visualizations, they do tend to be the very physical kinds of impacts, such as from sea level rise, storm surges, drought or fire risk, and so on. And I think just to attest to that, in another parallel breakout session happening right now, there's a complementary project on sunk investments, which was designed to actually use GIS to actually demonstrate the kind of property values that exist in highly vulnerable areas to sea level rise. What it does less well at is really this distinction of some of the creeping changes. And so where I have actually investigated vulnerability to the elderly, what we found is GIS is rather limited in terms of expressing that very concretely. It's very easy to dismiss those representations because all we're really able to distinguish is areas that are more vulnerable or less vulnerable relative to some baseline. And when you start putting that on a map, the people who live in those particular areas or those populations at risk want to engage in a debate and actually tell you exactly how not vulnerable they are. And in some sense, that's actually some of the best discussions, and that's where we've actually learned a lot about the agency of vulnerable populations and how to actually get them to express their resilience that can then be turned into constructive adaptations or resilience policies. So, so I believe that there's a lot of potential in using GIS for all kinds of problems and for all kinds of social risks, but obviously there's a range there, and some certainly are more obviously suited to spatial representations than others.
Great, thank you. Let's open it up to the audience. We've got a couple of questions.
Hi, Lynn. Your project is it's highly relevant to something I'm working on. I work for the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we're in the midst of doing our vulnerability assessment now, and we're taking a very similar approach where we're using, we're characterizing local climate impacts. We're using GIS. We have a community process to both collect information from the community, but also to engage in them in developing a common understanding of the risks that we're going to have to plan for. So some parts of that working well, some parts not as well. So I'm interested in talking shop with you at some point separately, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the subjective side of the integrative GIS model and how, are you collecting data that you're then putting into GIS, or how are you kind of marrying both sides of that?
In practice, some of it can actually be represented very easily, the subjective data, and you can. We've done actually work on surveys where we've collected survey information, particularly on perceptions of climate change and how people are perceiving the problem and their role within climate solutions. At the same time, some of the more intangibles in terms of what different worldviews and different community values that are expressed within a community, those actually don't necessarily get represented as concrete data, but come out through the engagements themselves as we sit in front of a map and we move information and reprioritize and change the weightings of different data that go into the vulnerability model. So that process is subjective in itself, but that's also how the subjective data does get incorporated into the final representation of the climate map. So it's very much both about some of the qualitative aspects that GIS can now handle in terms of narratives and photographs and sort of non-traditional or aspatial data that can actually be attached to spatial locations. But really, it's about the engagements themselves in terms of how you negotiate. It's really kind of if you're a map maker yourself, I guess I would say that it's really about opening up those final decisions in developing your spatial model to a wider audience, so that more of the perspectives in the communities are represented rather than simply the final map maker's decisions. So yeah, I think that's kind of where I'll leave it then in terms of the subjective elements.
Great, we've got one more question.
Hi, I just have a question. you mentioned a lot how there was a lot of, you worked with governments and a lot with residential, how they're emotionally tied. I'm just wondering how you involved small businesses that in the area that are also very close, have very emotional connections to the area and are really affected by the changing.
I think in that case, I actually need to clarify because the research I've done so far has been centered wholly on local governments. So we've actually been working, my research has looked really about how adaptation is taking place in municipalities in Norway and how our local municipalities are formulating their adaptation plans, in particular solving this real dilemma about the cross-jurisdictional issues that come up in terms of emergency management responses, the delivery of social services, and so on, getting different agencies to learn how to talk to one another. My interest, however, is to actually apply it in a very concrete way to actually bring in more of a community-based approach. The dynamics in Norway, the planning dynamics, at least in Norway, are very different than what they are in the United States. We have very top-down planning structures. And so at this point, I haven't actually explored widening the stakeholder group to include vulnerable populations directly or businesses themselves. But I see a lot of opportunities for doing so in the UK and in the United States in particular. When we've actually when we've taken our tool out to talk to communities, one of the things we've found is there's still quite a bit of resistance. This notion of vulnerability is still very difficult for individuals to accept. People have a really hard time accepting their own vulnerability, and so I think that'll be really a big challenge for us to overcome when I do actually try to formulate a postdoc or with a lot of luck to try to go forward with a collab integral GIS adaptation process. So for the moment, I haven't actually worked with businesses, but there is the opportunity to do so in a different kind of project.
Great. Back to Julia. Go ahead.
So, Lynn, in your intro, you briefly discussed kind of some of the foundational pieces of GIS data, indicators being one. And one of the advantages of that is that you can monitor changes over time and adjust. So what time interval are you going to incorporate into your process so that you can continue to get that knowledge from the residents so you can adjust your planning?
It's it's something that I think needs to be driven by the communities themselves. I can only speak for planning processes in Norway, which generally work with a 10 to 15 year long-term planning horizon that they're updating every 5 or so years. I would say that I think it's hard to generalize because every location and every city has different challenges and works slightly different. But I think sort of having this 10-year time horizon to check in and revise seems to work well for this context. And I think given the complications that are involved in actually coordinating participatory processes, it's a fairly reasonable horizon to be looking at. You often get a sort of a 1 or a 2 year break before you actually start your next planning, the initial planning process for the next plan that will sort of come after the 10-year current plan. But again, I think that has to actually be up to the community in terms of how they want to approach and revisit every plan that they develop.
Anything else? Oh, yeah, we've got a few more from the audience.
Hello, my name is Adrian Guzman, and I come from Mexico, from the southeast of Mexico, in a city named Jalapa, from jalapeno peppers come from, so I'm a jalapeno, or a pepper, whatever you want. I work for an ecology institute in Mexico, which belongs to the, NSF, basically. And I was asked to design a rapid response for resilience system, because we have a lot of floods in Veracruz. So basically, what we did was to take snapshots of social media communications for Twitter, and we embedded in a system which basically what allowed us is to obtain spreadsheets, and with these spreadsheets to develop sublayers which we can use with web, not web with B, but with P, GIS systems. So we already developed that because I think it was the closest way not only to track communications with these snapshots for very particular events, but also for to read a very specific sentiment. Like for example, my house is already flooded or whatever. Related to what you were saying with small business, this is a huge economic impact. Once I took here in the States a course with the director of the Small Business Administration, and he says that the better way to get funded for anything is it's a 3F system, which is friends, family, or fools. But I think that if you map the very first two groups or scenarios, which are family and friends, you are going to have a close a snapshot, a closed system for sentiment analysis, and that actually is going to give you a big picture of what can be actually be done. If you want, after, I can show you the system we developed, and I think it was good because we in Mexico, we don't have the culture of prevention. So it's we need to fix things right on the road. It's difficult because in countries like mine, you have to fight against cultural practices more than government or policies or whatever. No, I mean, once people actually don't prevent and they build their houses in places where they shouldn't, you cannot do anything. I mean, you can ask them to relocate, but they are going to tell you something like, "It's my house," and whatever. No? And sometimes they do against law. Sometimes they do just because they want. And I mean, you need to redesign rapidly when nature actually decides to do something. No? I mean, it's something which you have to fight against circumstances, and not because somebody decided to make some policy. You know? So we came with this solution. We're working now with the municipality of Jalapa from Jalapeños, you know? And we are working with the Rockefeller Foundation for maybe to get funded in a resilient program. So hopefully we'll do that. So.
Great comment. One thing that sort of caught my attention and something that I was thinking about is, you know, we do these kind of studies, at least in my experience, where you would go in and help a city formulate an adaptation plan or something like that, and it's in a lot of cases it's a one-time shot, and you know, a report is written and some things have a life beyond that. But one of the things that I think is really important that we try to think about doing, I think in both of these contexts for the different proposals, is how do we embed these areas of seeing how attitudes change over time, and I think the Twitter example that you talked about.
Because I mean, it's easier to read. It's much easier to read. I mean, all the data that you generated in Twitter, maybe it's like 20,000 tweets that I have in my Twitter account. It's 20,000 rows in a spreadsheet, and that's very handleable. It's very manageable. And if you have this spreadsheet, it's basically a digital footprint of what you actually was thinking, saying, or doing in without, I mean, being unconscious, in a certain way. And if you develop like emergent hashtags or a vocabulary for emergency or rapid response, as we did, we just liberate by radio or by press, or maybe with a communicate, something like, if your house is being flooded, just hashtag flood Veracruz 2013. And that's official, and it's the only communication that government needs to do. And with that, we can easily track, I mean, what actually it's happening. And we did. But unfortunately, I mean, it's only to make some rapid response analysis, but not to prevent, because I mean, with people it's very difficult, But well, I think it worked, and we are working on it. It's a digital footprint. Sorry.
I think there was an offer to share that. I'd love to, if you're sharing links or whatever, to be able to see it. Okay.
I wonder if I could chime in and sort of respond to this notion of how we actually can embed adaptation over the long term. Because I think one of the most important things, and right now we're in this bit of this transition phase where we've got a lot of single person expertise in municipalities who are really driving climate processes, and it isn't until we've really embraced the notion of a new climate regime that climate change really becomes part of the mainstream activities of all people at all levels of local government. I think one of the best examples that I've seen of that here in Norway has to do with a lot of the civil engineers that manage the regulations for storm drainage and so on. Because when I've talked to them in the past about adaptation and what are they doing to respond, the reaction is always, we're constantly adapting. For every new storm surge that is above a previous threshold, we change the thresholds. And I think that's a really nice example of an action that really serves to start embedding this process of change. This is very active and fluid response. And of course, the structures in Norway are such that they have the flexibility to make changes like that more or less on the fly. But I think it's a really empowering way in which we can start thinking about just how simple it actually is to start mainstreaming our responses that can facilitate climate resilience in the long term.
Lynn, do you find that those modifications are at such a low level, though, that it's not really sustainable over time? I mean, they're really doing, millimeters or inches in their engineering.
Well, in Norway, the problems, we actually have pretty substantial problems with rainfall and a lot of flooding. So I don't think that the changes are so incremental to be irrelevant at this point. I think, however, we still have a problem where communities are still making individual choices to build and develop in areas that are clearly at risk. And so one of I think the challenge, even though people are aware of climate change and aware of the long-term problems, we still I still see a lot of planning that is making decisions for short-term gain as opposed to longer-term time horizons. So classic examples is that we have fairly good flood mapping that is updated on surprisingly quick intervals, and yet municipalities, when they make their final development, economic development strategies, are often still choosing to put new structures in those floodplains, despite what the new mapping is actually indicating about the flood risk on a 5 or 10-year time horizon. So you know, we still have to battle our human nature to be able to think longer than the short-term economic benefits of actions today versus the consequences of climate in the long run.
Lynn, I've enjoyed your presentation. My name is Zach Gates. I'm a civil engineer. I especially appreciate your acknowledgement of the map as a platform for discussion, not as a final document. I'm curious, as you begin to integrate citizen data into a platform like this, do you have an algorithm of any sort for validating that data so that it doesn't become an astroturfing campaign? And I know crowdsourcing systems like Wikipedia and whatnot have very specific rules about how data gets, how documents get edited, and are there any good algorithms or decision processes in place that have been developed for this sort of for dealing with this sort of information?
That's a really good question, and it's a really hard problem to address. I think what I can say in my reading of the literature and my experiences in working on a participatory level with these kinds of planning processes so far is that oftentimes the processes have actually been relatively small, or they've been broken down into such small pieces that the stakeholders become familiar with one another, or are able to develop a common understanding so that the negotiation process is somewhat easier. There are cases where, in cases of conflict, you know, that it is actually necessary to maybe have side processes where there's a certain amount of joint fact-finding that takes place. But you know, what I've seen has often been that it's been a facilitated process that has been very the emphasis is always on transparency before that new knowledge comes into the data set.
Hi, it's Adrian again. Sorry, what you actually mentioned it's a problem we have to solve before. I work in a political campaign, so we have this huge amount of information which came from bots in Twitter, which were like fake messages or promotion, of some sort of promotion. So in politics that doesn't matter, but in terms of saving lives, actually that matters. So we use a previous solution where we actually didn't present the data directly on the map. So we have like a previous process of processing this data in spreadsheets and not with algorithms, but with the analysis in a previous layer before presenting into the map. You know? Because I mean, if we realize that a user was, I don't know, like having 20 tweets with the same some sort of information, probably it was not a reliable source of information. So I don't think presenting the data algorithmically directly on the map, it's a good solution. in this precisely case? Because I mean, you're speaking about saving lives. It's more. I mean, it's critical data, no, basically.
Hi, Lynn. Thanks so much for this. And what really hit me, and I'm glad you brought up the economic rationale or lack of rationale for what we continue to keep doing. And right after Sandy, Senator Markey, then Rep. Markey, showed us the floodplain of Boston, what would have happened if the storm had moved further north. And I'm still impressed by the fact that we're still building on the waterfront. So I'm curious about the work that you're doing right now. I'm not sure data sways people as much as we'd like it to do, and I'm wondering if there's any other kinds of, what other expectations are there so that all the stakeholders are going to be moved to perhaps do better planning, make better choices that are not economically driven, and that is our model, and I think that's what's will continue to cause us the most pain as we move forward with all of the climate challenges we have.
It's a really good point, and I mean, in some sense, you know, without taking too much of a normative perspective on things, my process is really intended to be a transparent process, and that's one of my motivations, so that the decision outcomes that are derived from actually using this mixed methods approach, you can trace them back and understand why those decisions were made the way they were. You know, I could still disagree with the decision, and I still might actually want a different kind of outcome for a floodplain, for example. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, if we have actually put decision makers in a position to make a decision, all we can actually hope for is the transparency in that decision-making process, whether or not we might, you know, agree with the final decision or not. And so, so I don't. My process doesn't actually promote or won't necessarily lead to more rational decisions based on other kinds of criteria, but it does very much make those criteria transparent and how they fed into the final process. And that's what I think is lacking to a certain degree in a lot of adaptation decisions today.
That's great. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, more.
I've been bouncing between this session and the session across the hall, which is about changing attitudes. And one of the winners there was just talking about their project, which is in the Bay Area, San Francisco. And they're looking at flooding maps and trying to put together a web page of information so that homeowners can see what the economic outcome might be if projected rainfall, projected floodplain, so forth and so on. And you might want to take a look at their work in relationship to yours. I know in Boston, there's a really excellent Building Resilience in Boston report, which is available online. And what's really good about that is that it's a survey of resilience and adaptation measures from cities all across the world. So it's a really good worldwide literature search that you can use to look at what other cities around the world are doing. In Boston, what I've heard people talk about from the city government is that what is now a 1% or 100-year flood by the end of the century will be a once-a-year or 100% event, right? And that's how they're thinking about planning for the end of the year. Cambridge, where I live, is going through the same process right now, and one of the people from Cambridge who's doing that is in this room. I know also that the Northeast utilities, the Northeastern utilities, are looking at a situation in which they've seen over the last 18 months to 2 years 300-year events that they've had to clean up after. So there are a number of different layers of people who by their jobs have had to take the reality of what we've seen already into account. Whether that's filtered down to the rest of the structures that make up our built environment is another question. But there are a number of places, as you point out, the civil engineering community in Norway, the planning community, the zoning communities, all of these people have figured it out. But it's like the reinsurance industry has figured out for 20 years that we have to deal with climate change, but the local insurance companies still haven't gotten the message. And it's how to reach through that gap all the way through. So those are some of my comments.
And I'd just add to it your comment about the insurance industry. One of the challenges that I've been thinking about a lot lately is currently under insurance structures there tend not to be any types of positive incentives in terms of a lower rate if you as a homeowner or you as a commercial real estate owner make changes that make your building more resilient. So I think there are certainly a lot of opportunities to have greater dialogue around sort of some of those pricing structures. And those do factor into these types of concepts as well from the planning and figuring out who you're going to engage.
We're getting close on time, so some final wrap-up thoughts from the panel I think would be great. Or if you want to comment on just this last specific point.
I would just say the discussion that started emerging here I think is really interesting, and it's sort of pointing out that there's an information issue, right? The information can't just be a one-way transmittal, as Lynn so eloquently put it. It has to be a two-way street so that the information is both created and understood by the different stakeholders at play. But that information also, Lynn, I didn't get your name, but Linda was raising this issue of sort of if the economic incentives are misaligned, information plays only one of the necessary ingredients to sort of drive the kind of decisions around resilience and adaptation that we need. And I think it's just a very useful conversation for us to be thinking of holistically so that all of those parts can be worked on. And I think it was Zach raised this point about the sort of reliability of the citizen input into the information process, and I think it's going to remain an issue. And I think, for me, I'm very interested in the question you raised, and if others have thoughts about this, I'm really interested to learn more. Sort of what are the models and ways of vetting that information so that we can increasingly rely upon it, because the goal should be to be able to increasingly rely upon it. And there's a larger discussion, I think, in the realm of citizen science about where scientists are trying to grapple with how to deal with citizen-created data that might help this conversation about resiliency and adaptation move forward as well. So I'm just very grateful to everyone here because I think the conversation has been really productive and helpful to me as well, and I hope to many of you.
I can respond to Bina's request. So in Massachusetts, we developed a coastal storm damage reporting system called Storm Reporter, and it's a way to get on-the-ground information on impacts during storm events, what's happening to our natural resources as well as the built environment. And the way that we got around the issue of uncertainty in the reporting is that we actually do local training workshops for municipal officials as well as residents who have easy access to hotspot areas during events and just seasonally. And we work through the elements of the data that we're looking for, give them tips on how to be safe when they go out there, and then they get approved to have online access to our data reporting system. And they also now have the ability to use mobile applications as well. And that way, we have confidence in the information that's coming in, and we can use it directly in our GIS system.
Great. So I think that probably wraps us up in terms of time. This has been a really great conversation, no doubt. Due to the excellent proposals, congratulations to both Michael and Lynn for getting to this point. Good luck in getting the big prize at the end. I think that this conversation could also continue on the CoLab platform. I've kind of been discovering it as gearing up for this thing, and it seems like a great way that we can continue this dialogue if there's room to do that. Also, thank you very much for the panelists. Definitely the conversation was benefited from the depth of your experience as well. So thanks again.
And your excellent moderating skills.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.